Welcome back to Chapter 7, Skeletal System. We're going to continue our discussion on how bones grow and develop. So, first things first, the process of forming bone is called ossification. We already know that os or ossi refers to bone. Fication is the process where something is created. I'd like you to still look that up. So do a Google search for something that says something like define fication and put fication in quotation marks so that you can look up specifically that part of the word. You have intramembranous bones. So these are bones that are created from sheet-like layers of connective tissues, intramembranous. So these sheet-like layers are the membranes that the bones are formed within. Parts of the skeletal system begin to develop during the first few weeks of prenatal development. So your skeletal system will begin to grow just a few weeks after the egg had been fertilized from sperm. That's basically what that means. Bony structures continue to grow and develop into adulthood. So, well into your 20s, you still have bones that are growing. And as after your growth plates have completely closed, bones are still developing because the body is so efficient. It's going to remodel bone according to whether you are doing work or not. So the increase or decrease of activity will allow your body to redevelop those bones. Bones form when the bone tissue replaces existing connective tissue in one of two ways. So remember that your fetus, your newborn, has bony structures that are not quite developed, they're not quite calcified, they're not quite hardened. In order to make them actual bones, there are two processes that can occur. You have intramembranous bones, and then you have endochondral bones. Now let's get into the difference between the two. So intramembranous bones or intramembranous ossification is the process of creating hardened ossified bones from those sheet-like layers of connective tissues where the bones will originate. These are your broad bones, your flat bones, so the bones of your skull, except the mandible. The mandible is not made in the same way. Your clavicles, your sternum, and your facial bones all are broad, flat bones that are created originally by these sheet-like layers of connective tissues that are laid down. And then these intramembranous ossification centers go in and lay down the calcified material to create bones. On the other hand, the long bones and the rest of the bones of the skeleton are created from endochondral ossification. If we remember, chondral refers to cartilage, endo means inside of. So this is the formation of bone, so ossification, inside of cartilage. These bones will begin as hyaline cartilage models, which means that the structure itself is made up of primarily hyaline cartilage, which you already know because we talked about that in tissues. Um, and these are again the long bones and most of the bones of your skeleton. I put these two YouTube links here for you to be able to go back to them to have the processes of intramembranous bone and endochondral bones explained a little bit more. So if you need that explanation, please click these links so that you can get a better explanation of these processes, along with using your book. Don't forget your book is your resource. So intramembranous bones originate within these sheet-like connective tissues. Um, the way it starts is you have these mesenchymal cells in primitive tissue that differentiate into osteoblasts. So if you remember when we talked about, or when you learned about how embryos develop, there were cells called mesenchymal cells that were present in and throughout the organism. These mesenchymal cells will eventually differentiate into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts, remember, osteo means bone, blasts, the word you see the suffix blast. Think of building. So anything that is a blast is a builder type of cell. An osteoblast specifically is a cell that builds bone. So these are bone forming cells that deposit that bony matrix around themselves. So all of the inorganic salts and other things that are deposited into those structures that create the hard bone that we know of is laid down by these osteoblasts in the surrounding matrix. When the osteoblasts finish surrounding itself by this hardened matrix, they are now considered osteocytes because they no longer have to lay anything down to actually build bone. They can just exist and maintain the structures around them, the bony matrix around them. These osteocytes live in lacuna, just like your chondrocytes did. Then, once that has finished forming, the mesenchyme that's on the outside or on the periphery of these bony structures will then start to create periosteum. Endochondral bones will then will form from the masses of hyaline cartilage. Remember your intramembranous bones formed from sheet-like layers of connective tissue. Those were the membranes inside of which bones are developed. In the chondral bone formation, you have this hyaline cartilage that is what makes up most of the bones we have, including your long bones and others. So your femur, your humerus, so your leg bone, your arm bone, your tibia and fibula, which are your long lower leg bones. Your radius is your lower arm bone. Phalanges are your finger bones. Vertebrae are the bones of your spine. So in this endochondral ossification process, the bones begin as hyaline cartilage models. These chondrocytes, again, remember chondro means cartilage. Cyto means cell. So chondrocytes are your cartilage cells. These get larger. The lacunae start to grow. The matrix around them breaks down. And then this chondrocyte begins to die. Osteoblasts, remember these are bone building cells. They start to invade the area that was left by the chondrocyte that died, and they start to deposit the bony matrix, the inorganic salts, and other materials that actually harden the bone. These osteoblasts form spongy bone, and then it forms the compact bone. So your spongy bone forms first, then your compact bones forms later. Once it's encased by the matrix, the osteoblasts then become osteocytes because it no longer has to build any bone. It just maintains the bony matrix around it. So you have your primary ossification center. These are the areas in the center of the diaphysis where your bone tissue first replaces your cartilage. So primary ossification center, first place where cartilage is replaced. Replacement of the bone proceeds toward the ends of the bone. So it sort of starts in the middle. Here it says the area in the center of the diaphysis, and it grows outward toward the ends or the edges of the bones. The osteoblasts from the periosteum deposit compact bone around those primary centers. So you have these osteoblasts, these bone building cells that form around the outside or the periphery of this bony model that's being built, and it deposits compact bone as opposed to spongy bone around that primary center. The secondary ossification center, these are the areas of the epiphysis where your spongy bone starts to form later in development. Then you have your epiphyseal plate. This is a band of cartilage that lives between this primary ossification center that is in the center of the diaphysis and the secondary ossification center that is in the epiphysis. that is where your epiphyseal growth plate lives. At 14 weeks old, or 14 weeks of development, that's when you'll start to see both the intramembranous and the endochondral bone being developed inside of the fetus. There is a condition where bones don't properly start to form. This is osteogenesis imperfecta. This is a hereditary defect of collagen where the collagen doesn't form, or it doesn't form as strongly, and the bones that form are brittle, which means that the fetus and then the baby will have many different bone fractures throughout their life because they have this defect in the collagen that is supposed to strengthen bones and make them more resilient. So this is a comparison of bone connective tissue and hyaline cartilage connective tissue. So your bone connective tissue has osteoblasts, which form the matrix or build the bone, whereas in your connective tissue, your cartilage, you have chondroblasts, which build the cartilage. Once that matrix is laid down around those cells, they no longer need to build, they just need to maintain. So that becomes an osteocyte for your bone connective tissue where it's maintaining bone. And those that maintain cartilage are called chondrocyte. You don't have calcium present in the cartilage connective tissue because the calcium presence is what makes it hardened, and it makes it bone. So you won't have calcium in your connective tissue. I'm sorry, in your cartilage connective tissue, but you will have it in your bone. In your bone, you have an extensive network of blood supplies. We saw that going through the osteon, where you had a vein, um, uh, you have you have the artery, you have the vein, you have the nerve, etc., that go through the osteon. And then so every osteon that you have this supply that flows throughout the bone, whereas your hyaline cartilage is largely avascular, which means that there are no blood vessels that flow throughout it. This these cells will get their nutrients from diffusion from nearby tissues. Here again are the videos about the intramembranous bone development and your endochondral bone development, and a chart that explains the two of them. So if you need more of a chart as an explanation, here you are. And again, for those of you who want videos, these are videos that can help you understand this process a little bit better. Again, further explaining intramembranous ossification using pictures and words. So if you want this description, please read over it. And the endochondral ossification process. Let's talk a little bit about that epiphyseal growth plate. So the epiphyseal plate, again, as I mentioned before, is also called the growth plate or the epiphyseal growth plate. You can also call this the physis. So sometimes you'll see physis instead of the entire word epiphyseal plate or growth plate. This is the band of cartilage that remains between the two ossification centers, that primary ossification center in the diaphysis and that secondary ossification center in the epiphysis. In growing long bone, the epiphyseal plate separates the diaphysis from the epiphysis. This area is called the metaphysis. Where the growth plate resides is called the metaphysis. This is the region where the bone actually grows in length. Cartilaginous cells of the epiphyseal plate form 4 different layers, and we're about to learn the 4 layers of the epiphyseal plate. In this image, you see the arrows pointing to what looks like spaces in between the parts of the bone. So this is a long bone of the hand. This is one of the metacarpals. So this hand bone is a metacarpal. This is the diaphysis. This is the epiphysis. This space in between that looks clear is the metaphysis or the growth plate. And you'll see it also here. So you have the diaphysis, you have the epiphysis, and you have this growth plate. The reason why it looks like a space in between is because this is an X-ray. And in X-rays, you will only pick up the bony structures. The more dense the structure, the whiter it is, which is why here on the edges, the image is a brighter white than in the middle. Remember that on the edges of long bones, you have compact bone. So this compact bone is compact, it's more dense, so it will appear white in this image, whereas in the center you have a thinner or more gray looking appearance. That is because the bone is not as compact or dense in those areas. Here, you remember that I said that the epiphyseal growth plate is made up of cartilage, and because it's cartilage, it's not hardened at all, so it looks like a space in between these two sections of the bone. So if you look at the child's entire hand, you see epiphyseal plate there, 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 here in the fingers, here, here, right here. So the entire hand skeleton is continuing to grow in this child. So that's what we're looking at. So now you have the 4 layers of the epiphyseal plate, each of which may be several cell layers thick. You have the zone of resting cartilage is the first zone. You have the zone of proliferating cartilage as your second zone, the zone of hypertrophic cartilage as your third area, and the zone of calcified cartilage as your fourth area. So to recap, we have resting, proliferating, hypertrophy, and then calcify. Now, even just looking at these words, this should give you an idea of how bone is laid down in the long bones and calcified. So first you have these cartilaginous cells that just kind of rest. They're just there waiting their turn. Then you have this proliferation process where the cells grow. So proliferation means, it sort of like means be fruitful and multiply. So the cells are multiplying or proliferating in this area. Then you have hypertrophy. Hyper means excessive or high amounts. Trophy means growth. So in an area of hypertrophy, you may or may not have division of cells or multiplication of cells, but you'll definitely have growth of the cells that are present. And then it becomes hard and calcified. So it's resting, waiting its turn. It's growing and dividing, so you have more and more cells. Then you have the zone where the cells are actually growing and getting bigger. And then after they've gotten bigger, they become calcified and hardened to form the actual hardened bone. So let's go looking into these layers a little bit more detail. So this is an image of the epiphyseal growth plate. So here, this is the resting area, right? So your cells are just kind of sitting. If you notice that it looks like hyaline cartilage, what you've learned about hyaline cartilage, if we were to blow this area up a little bit more, my mouse is not showing up, you'll see like cells that are not densely packed. You have lots of this purple space in between each cell. That is your extracellular matrix. That is how you recognize cartilage cells or cartilage tissue. So this is your resting area. You have your proliferation area. So you see how you have these areas of stacked coins? That is the zone of these cells growing and dividing. So you have this one cell here, and then that divided and became 2 cells, and then that divided and became 4 cells. And these stack of coins are your telltale sign of this zone of proliferation. So then after these cells are born, these new cells have come into existence, now they need to grow, they need to hypertrophy. And that's what this area is. You'll notice that these stack of coins, these cells are starting to get larger here. This cell is larger than these cells because this is the area where they are actually growing. Then you have this area of calcification. So the matrix around the bone is starting to harden, and then the cells will eventually die. All right. So you have resting, proliferation, hypertrophy, and then calcification. And to look at it in a different place, your remember your bone is growing. The diaphysis is the part that lengthens your bone. So the resting zone will be closer to the epiphysis on either side, so the distal and the proximal epiphysis. And your calcification zone will be closer to your diaphysis, and it grows in that way. So closer to the resting zone, closer to the calcification zone. The zone of resting cartilage is your first layer. These are closest to the ends of the epiphysis. And again, remember that you have an epiphysis on both the distal and the proximal end of each of your long bones. It is composed of your resting cells that do not actively participate in growth. They're just kind of sitting there chilling, waiting on their turn to start doing some stuff. Up until that time, they're not really doing much of anything. They're just holding space. This zone of resting cartilage will anchor the epiphyseal plate to the bony tissue of the epiphysis. So this is going to keep your bones together while they're growing. Then you have that second layer of proliferating cartilage. Lots of young cells that are undergoing mitosis. And that is what looked like that stack of coins in the image that we saw earlier. So this stack of coins is that proliferation. As new cells appear and as extracellular matrix forms around them, the cartilaginous plate thickens. So the cartilage that is surrounding these starts to get thicker as more of these cells proliferate and come into being. You have your hypertrophic cartilage. This is the third layer. Please pause the video, look up the word hypertrophic so that you can know what it means for yourself, and then look up the suffix or the word root trophic. All right, define trophic again so that you can know what it means anytime you see that word or that word part. This is the zone they've already proliferated. Now they need to grow and become their own bone, right? So just like you, as a new adult, you are coming into your own. You're growing into your adultness. You are in your hypertrophic cartilage stage, so to speak. All right, so rows of older cells left behind when the new cells appear. It thickens the epiphysis. I can't say the word either. It thickens the epiphyseal plate. Consequently, this lengthens the bone. Then your osteoblasts that invade the area, remember these were chondrocytes before, the osteoblasts that build, remember blasts build bone. So these are bone building cells. They secrete calcium salts in this extracellular matrix that begins to accumulate. As this matrix starts to calcify, the chondrocyte begins to die, but this osteoblast is still in that area, laying down these inorganic salts to help calcify the area. Then you have your zone of calcified cartilage. That's the fourth layer. This is a thin layer that's composed of dead chondrocytes. Remember, these chondrocytes died as the matrix began to become calcified. And you have the calcified extracellular matrix laid down. So again, another image, we're looking in the metaphysis. So you have your zone of resting cartilage. Your cells are few and far between, lots of this hyaline matrix surrounding each of the cells. Eventually, these cells start to proliferate and divide. That's where you have that typical stack of coins appearance. Once these coins have been, I'm sorry, these cells have been made or created, they can start to hypertrophy or get bigger and grow, as you can see here. So that's what this is. This is actual bone, where the cells have, they're resting here, they are dividing here, these stack of coins, and now they're growing, they're coming into their own. And after they come into their own, they start to lay down some calcium. And as the calcium is laid down, the chondrocyte begins to die, that osteoblast continues to lay down that calcium and other inorganic salts that help to calcify and harden the bone, and then you have your actual bone proper. We are going to pause here and continue with the next video.